and welcome to a very special EWTN Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host, and I'm joined by the magic of television by Dr. Alice von Hildebrand and John Henry Crosby to talk about Dietrich von Hildebrand's book, My Battle Against Hitler, published by Image and available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. And again, great to at least get an opportunity to talk about this new exciting work, My Battle Against Hitler. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, we're very happy to be here. Thanks, Doug.
Now, let me ask you, John Henry, you were the editor along with your dad on this particular book. How was it for you to work with Lily on this book?
Well, it was, first of all, it was an incredible privilege to work with her. And it was also very exciting because when this project began, I had a German edition that had been published in the 90s. And it was very interesting and very academic, but what I didn't realize is that when I would get to work with her, I would begin to find things in her files. She has this lovely expression of things sleeping in my files. Well, I found many incredible things. I found the passport with which von Hildebrand escaped from France and in a drawer in her room. And I found all sorts of incredible documents. I found hate mail that was sent to Hildebrand's anti-Nazi newspaper in Vienna, just flipping through the files. So there was an element of detective work that made it just a pleasure and an exciting adventure.
Mm-hmm. Now, Alice, it was really your prodding that got your husband to actually sit down and write his memoirs. This isn't a diary, but a memoir, right?
When I was quite a bit younger than he was, and I was so conscious of the fact from the day that I met him that he was an extraordinary person. And I truly grieved and suffered because there was a whole part of his life I hadn't shared with him. So one very fine day I said to him, it grieves me profoundly that I haven't shared your life. I entered into your life when you're already an older person. And he said to me, I'll write it for you. The next morning he started. Now, he had a phenomenal memory. And he was a sort of person who wanted to share everything with the person that he loved. And so he started at the age 3, and he relates in his life in such detail that it is my claim that never was a husband so eager to share every single detail of his life with his wife. And he started writing, and he wrote at a fantastic speed, sometimes 30 pages a day. And he would read them to me when I came back from Hunter, and it went on and on and on until Vatican II. And then Vatican II became so concerned about what was happening in the church that he stopped in the middle of a sentence. That is to say, he relates his life until 1937, shortly before the drama of having to leave Austria. I kept this document. It was not meant for publication. But then several of my friends with whom I shared part of the story said, this is an historical document of such importance, I think that it should be published. And this is how John Henry's grandfather came in, and then it seems to be inherited because his father then got interested in it, and then finally John Henry. And so now, to my great, great joy, for the first time, the American and English public is going to be informed about his extraordinary life and his heroic fight against Hitler, where he lost everything and did not hesitate for a single moment.
Right, exactly. I know, Alice, the idea in the book that's put in here in the beginning, which I know was kind of put together by you, John Henry, talks about his whole idea of his commitment and his ability to basically abandon his life for the truth. And the quote here is, "My innermost conviction that objective truth exists and can be known. It also shows my capacity for remaining uninfluenced by my environment, my immunity to ideas that are somehow in the air." And you even talk about in this book the idea that when he was just 5, he stood up on his bed and stretched out his hair and basically told his mother that Christ is God when she was saying, well, he's not really God.
Well, let me say something on this. So the episode that you cite and all of the early episodes that are in the introduction to the book showcase something which I think can be summarized under the category broadly of an extraordinary independence from his environment. I mean, what 5 or 6 year old is so uninfluenced by the opinions of their parents, especially of a religious or a moral nature. This is usually the primary source of those views when we're so young. And yet von Hildebrand had just an extraordinary ability to go his own way. He had a kind of sense for truth wherever he found it. It's clearly he clearly had a kind of genius for it, which was then developed through his philosophical studies and then through his when he converted to Catholicism. But I think if we ask ourselves, what does the early life of von Hildebrand, how does it forecast what was to come in his fight against the Nazis? It's definitely connected to this independence of spirit that allowed him to be free of the great ideologies of the day. The sort of when you consider how many of his contemporaries were swept up by the siren song of either National Socialism or communism, and you realize that he was totally unimpressed by it, one has to ask, what could have been the basis for that? And I think all of these wonderful episodes from his youth and his childhood, which are documented in the book, give us a clue into that independent spirit.
Now, one of the things that I read in the book too in the beginning too was the idea that the Nazi Party was born in his hometown in Munich, and it says here he was predestined to be an enemy of the Nazi. Now, Alice, was that something that he felt at the time or something he realized later?
Well, number one, already as a child, he had a passion for the word truth. And he reminds me of St. Augustine. St. Augustine relates in his Confessions that when he read Cicero, and certainly the wisdom was mentioned, and he says, my heart was on fire, and I wanted to seek it and pursue it and live it. Now, you can see, for my husband, the word truth made his heart beat faster, already when he was a young boy. Number two, the love for truth, and number two, God had given him an extraordinary mind. I've never met another person in my life whose vision of reality was so accurate, so fair, so judged, so unprejudiced. And so the very moment that the first movement of Nazism came in, he saw the danger. Many people, number one, don't have the gifts. Number two, they fear to see truth. He never feared it, and he was conscious of the fact this is a danger of such tremendous dimension that I must fight against it with every single means in my power. And I mean, this is where from 1921, when they were the first currents of Nazism, he opposed it. And he did so at the risk of his life. He lost his property, he lost everything. And he said to me, I never hesitated. It was not even for me a temptation, to play safe, to keep a low profile in Germany. I knew my calling was to oppose it and to fight it with every means in my power.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, Alice, because in the book as well, there's a question that he kind of talks about, which is the idea of it confronted him with a decision, Hitler's rise. Would he remain in Germany or not? Indeed, could he remain? What did his conscience demand? What was God asking of him versus, let's say, a Bonhoeffer? Looking back on those years, did he ever question that decision to leave?
When he left Munich, very soon after Hitler came to power, and he knew that he was on the blacklist in some fashion, but I mean, he left with only one suitcase, crossed the Brenner, and they didn't stop him. He lost absolutely everything, and then he settled in Florence. At that time, there was still, Mussolini was not yet the ally of Hitler. As a matter of fact, he had criticized Hitler very strongly, and he went to his sister in Florence, who had inherited this magnificent property in Florence, and he was safe there. And from there on, he said, I'm going to try to use every means in my power. And he was isolated. Nobody seemed to care very much. People were enjoying their lives until he saw in August 1933 that the young Chancellor of Austria, Dollfuss, was absolutely clear-sighted about the danger of Nazism. And so he went to Vienna, managed to have a personal interview with Dollfuss, and explained to him, he says, Herr Chancellor, I realize that you see the danger. Would you help me to found a magazine in which I'm going to tear the philosophy of Nazism and communism to pieces? Dollfuss enjoyed it, supported it, And my husband then devoted his whole life to, in Vienna, he wrote 67 articles to tear to pieces the philosophy of Nazism. Now, 8 months later, or 7 months later, Dollfuss was assassinated by the Nazis. And in this very moment, he was replaced by Chancellor Schuschnigg, who was not a bad man, but was a man who said, peace at all price. You know, if actually we show our kindness and friendliness towards Germany, then obviously they're going to pay us back and being equally friendly. It was nothing but an illusion. And he saw it later. Then the very moment that the question was, is Germany going to invade Austria or not? And Schuschnigg started a plebiscite and he wanted us to peace. Hitler had the information that they were going to lose, and so invaded Austria. That was on the 11th of March, 1938, my birthday by accident. And suddenly he got the news on the radio that the Austrian government had resigned. He knew that the Nazis had rented an apartment across the sea and went following every one of his moves. He knew had been warned by the chief of secret police and they tried to assassinate him. He realized he must leave the country. Now, very wisely, and he was not always very, very wise, he left his apartment to take a walk. His hat, his cane, and his coat, and that's all he had. And then walked to the end, from there to took a taxi, told his wife, follow me with one suitcase. They took the last train leaving Austria for Czechoslovakia, Bratislava. The train was full of Jews that were fleeing. And realizing the moment they arrived at the border, they were told no Austrian citizen can leave the country. He had become an Austrian citizen when he started teaching at the University of Vienna, but never took a passport. He had inherited a Swiss passport from his grandfather and showed his Swiss passport, passed the border, it was in Bratislava, calls the maid, and the maid says, oh, you just missed great visitors at 2 in the morning. 5 Nazi Gestapo came to arrest you. And he had just escaped. And then the next day, there was a warrant in arrest of all the borders. But I mean, from there he went to Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, northern Italy, and settled in Switzerland when he was saved because he was a Swiss citizen, and stayed there for 9 months until he was called to University of Toulouse in France. And then a few months later, of course, Hitler invaded Holland, Belgium, and France. Once again, he had to go into hiding, and thanks to false papers, he managed to come to escape, to leave, and was in Lisbon. And in Lisbon, he found out the Rockefeller Foundation was paying his trip to the United States. From there, he had to go to Brazil, and from Brazil, he came to New York on the 23rd of November, 1940, and then he started to teach at Fordham.
Well, let me ask you, too, going back, John Henry, and thinking about the early days, you know, you think about, because the memoirs cover some of the dates in the 1920s and then jump up to the 30s, and a lot of us, you know, think about Hitler more than the 30s than we do in the 20s, but Dietrich von Hildebrand was really at ground zero when the Nazis started up with the beer hall putsch in Munich, which was his hometown. One of the things I was wondering, and maybe you've thought about it, or maybe Alice has thought about it, did we ever think about why is it that Nazism would rise up in a particular area of Germany, which in theory was fairly Catholic?
It's a very good point. It's a very good question. And in some ways, I don't want to speculate on a program like this because it's one of the most debated questions in the history of the period. But a couple of comments drawing maybe from von Hildebrand's essays might be illuminating. First of all, of course, you had, I think as the historians would all point out, you had a lot of the right conditions for any kind of radical movement in Germany at the time. There was a great sort of craving for authority and for leadership. There was a lot of political violence, a lot of political instability. And so to have a leader who promised order and presented himself with a strong arm, and basically had his private military through the SA and then the SS later on. This on the one hand generated a lot of terror, but it was appealing at the same time. But I think von Hildebrand might have made an additional point. He says in one of his essays from 1941, which is published in the book called Against Anti-Semitism, he says that anti-Semitism was the forerunner of National Socialism, and he goes on to say that a weakness, a lack of resistance towards anti-Semitism in countries like Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, weakened the moral resolve. He said it broke down the moral barrier that was necessary to resist National Socialism. So there was a kind of sympathy for National Socialism already because of its strong allegiance with anti-Semitism. So this isn't to say that Munich had any particularly high degree of it. In fact, Hildebrand also says in the memoirs, in 1921, there's an episode where he describes what he calls his first encounter with anti-Semitism. But it rose quickly and it gained popular support. Of course, this was also true in Austria, where he would go. There was a lot of anti-Semitism there. And I think this is one of the hardest themes of this book, is the realization that there were many Catholics who were anti-Semites, and there were a lot of Catholics who were anti-Nazis, who were still anti-Semitic themselves.
Yes, I would also think in that time, coming out of World War I, there was a lot of blaming going on for how Germany could have lost, and kind of being tricked by those who are at home, the bankers. And certainly we hear all about that in Mein Kampf. That's what Hitler's whole thesis is. It's also interesting, too, because in the book, you bring out, von Hildebrand says, what really sets him apart from many of his contemporaries was his total freedom from the comparatively moderate anti-Semitism that was widespread in the 20s and 30s. He said even Catholics, and this is what you were saying, who spoke out against Nazism and personally protected the Jews could simultaneously harbor antipathy for the supposed liberalism and moral degeneracy of the Jews. Sometimes you would tend to have the Jewish populace associated with communism, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, this is something that National Socialism thrived on, which was to present itself as the guardian of the German people against the Red Threat, which was always supposedly coming over from the East. And so no doubt there was a great deal of exploitation, of fear that happened through Nazi propaganda. But again, I think in von Hildebrand's case, you make a very good point. He was not only free, he was of course free from the kind of poisonous anti-Semitism that the Nazis later created when they wanted to exterminate all the Jews, but the comparatively mild, sort of socially acceptable anti-Semitism that lived on even in Catholic circles. There's a very fearful episode when von Hildebrand speaks to the Catholic seminarians in Vienna in 1935, I believe it is, and he says to them that a particular danger in Austria is a traditional anti-Semitism, and he says, for you at this moment of crisis, the great call is to rid yourself of this anti-Semitism. And upon making this statement, almost half of the seminarians left the lecture hall in protest. So it shows you how deep and pervasive this anti-Semitism was, even in places which were deeply Catholic.
Right. He talks about, in fact, I guess in here, in the attitude of the two friars, who I saw so clearly the danger of compromise by German Catholics. We Catholics have to put ourselves in the front ranks of National Socialism and in this way give everything a Catholic turn. The idea that to some degree there was this thought process that the Nazis could be steered, so to speak.
That's an extremely important theme in this book, this recognition right from the beginning that one couldn't deal with Nazism. There was nothing redeemable in it. It was totally corrupt. It was, as he said, the Antichrist raises its head in National Socialism. And so von Hildebrand, one of the great achievements of von Hildebrand was the ability to recognize what Nazism was before its worst consequences came out. You know, many people later on saw what National Socialism was, but as you describe in the episode there were many priests, particularly among leading Catholics. There was this, maybe it was a desperation, maybe it was wishful thinking, as von Hildebrand sometimes says, but nevertheless there was this idea that somehow one could Catholicize National Socialism, and the idea was to sort of take leadership positions within National Socialism. Granted, that idea was quickly dispelled when Hitler's attack on the church became much more evident, but the fact remains that Hildebrand was totally immune to that at precisely a moment when many of his fellow Catholics were falling for it.
Now, Alice, Dietrich actually had a conversation with the Secretary of State, Cardinal Pacelli, who obviously became famous much later, and he indicated that at the time that he thought there was a moment in Germany, of the kind that only comes around every 3 or 4 centuries, in which millions of Protestants and socialists would have converted had the bishops stood up. Did he ever talk to you more about that understanding he had about that situation?
You know, look, from the day of his conversion, the Roman Catholic Church was a great love of his life. Of course, the Church as bride of Christ. He had such a respect for the Church, such a love for the Church, such a respect for the priesthood, that the first time he went to Rome after his conversion, every time he met a priest on the street, he took off his hat to indicate a respect he knew, someone who is a representative of Christ and can change water, bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. I can only tell you that when he discovered that many German bishops called out to Hitler, his heart was broken. You know, he was Italian by temperament, and he was someone who could sob. And there were things in life that make it sob, meaning to say, these people are called upon to raise their head and say, we don't want this, this is evil, and we're going to fight it. And unfortunately, in August 1933, there was a meeting of all German bishops in Fulda. All of them were very, very weak, except 2. I recall the one Preissing, who was the Bishop of Berlin, was very courageous, but most of them sort of, you know, the fear of German Catholics were, we are not good patriots. We are not truly faithful to our country. We place Rome above Germany. And, you know, there was this, Deutschland über alles. Germany should be, and he refused. Now, obviously, later on, they started to open their eyes. And then, for example, Bishop von Gallen became a hero, and several of them became very, very... But at first, they refused to see, number 1, because it was dangerous, number 2, because there were consequences, and the fear that they would simply name, we are not good Germans. You see, now, for Dietrich von Hildebrand, and I think it's perfectly clear, the very moment that you convert, you understand that God and His Church are number 1. And he makes a very important distinction between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism means my country above everything else, and he rejected it. But patriotism is legitimate love for the country that raised you. I mean, after all, Germany had a magnificent musical culture. And I mean, my husband was passionate for great music. So I mean, his debt to Germany was very great indeed. And he recognized this great literature, the great architecture, lots of things they inherited. But when it came to the question of truth, God has priority. And I mean, this is in that they lived, risking his life, losing everything, and finding at every single moment he did not regret it. When I met him, he was a beggar. He had holes in his shoes, but he was happy that he had lost everything for the sake of God and His Church.
Right, and to follow up on Alice just said, I mean, there was very comments by others who talked about what a happy person he was. And it's interesting, too, as well, there's a couple of things I thought. You've got a picture here of a Catholic bishop who's one of the great apologists, and also von Papen, who was the one who actually has the letter where they're talking about how Dietrich von Hildebrand is really the number 1. And this was the letter he wrote to the Fuhrer, where you see names like Himmler included in the letter. It gives you the idea of the degree of concern there was about von Hildebrand's work against the Nazis and how critical it was for them to silence him. But just the idea that there was also this sense out there, because von Papen was a Catholic, quote unquote, and there was this, I go back to that one conversation, which I thought was really interesting, his insight when he was talking with Cardinal Pacelli, who was saying, well, maybe we can hope things will be better if the moderate elements in the Nazis win out. And he says, the moderate elements are the most dangerous. far better that we have people like Rosenberg, who was known as the Jew baiter, who dropped their mask and openly revealed the absolute incompatibility of Nazism with the Christian faith, than those who confuse and mislead Catholics by concealing their attack on Christ. Because a lot of people were misled because the Nazis would say things that made it sound like they were willing to allow churches to go along, correct?
Absolutely. I think I couldn't agree with you more that there was a great deal of misleading on the part of the Nazis, which won a lot of the Catholics. But it should be said that, to complement what Dr. von Hildebrand said a moment ago, that I think what made von Hildebrand so effective as a voice was, on the one hand, that he was a powerful opponent and critic of National Socialism, someone who could deconstruct it, but he also presented a positive alternative. Another vision of Europe, a vision of Christian Europe. He says in the mission statement of his journal that the mission of the journal is to represent all of the great categories of truth and justice and human dignity and freedom. And so I think that he might not have had on the one hand, we needed the prophetic voice condemning the evil of National Socialism. On the other hand, I think what won many people over and helped them to find the courage to resist National Socialism was the fact that he reminded them of something deeper and better and more, something that they could ultimately live for.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd just like to, as we've just out of time, thank you so much, John Henry Crosby, for working with our dear friend, Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, and we thank her for being such a loyal wife, and a wife who has championed her husband's cause for many years, and to brought forward this great writing by Dietrich von Hildebrand, My Battle Against Hitler, subtitled Faith, Truth, and Defiance in the Shadow of the Third Reich, published by Image, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Highly recommend this read. There's an adventure and there's faith all wrapped in one. Thank you so much for joining us here on this very special bookmark with Dr. Alice von Hildebrand and John Henry Crosby.